Good morning. Governor Cooper has declared June 2022 as LGBTQ Pride Month. OSHR is excited to celebrate this morning with our guest speaker, Chuck Wheeler, coordinator for Out South. He will be sharing the festival's history, how it celebrates LGBTQ plus life and builds community, its place among similar LGBTQ plus film festivals, and what's planned for Out South's 27th year at Durham's historic Carolina Theater. Before we go further into today's program, I would like to do some housekeeping. As always, keep your microphones on mute throughout the entire session. Please send all of your questions to the chat room. The chat room will be monitored and we will look to make sure all of your questions are answered in an orderly fashion. This session will be recorded and you will be able to view this session program later on later on demand. And speaking of on-demand recordings, you will be notified soon of this program's availability and all of May's programs when they are ready to be viewed. We appreciate your patience with our on-demand recording. June is also a very busy month for us here at OSHR, and we are pleased to announce the following upcoming programs. June the 22nd will be our Juneteenth celebration, so please tune in on June the 22nd for Juneteenth celebration. And in July, on July the 19th, we will have our ADA celebration, and you will get information about that from me very soon. We look forward to seeing you at both of those programs. In a moment, I'm going to turn the program over to James Harris, and he's going to introduce today's speakers. Just give me one moment to turn it over to James, and he will come on to introduce our speaker. James?
Thank you, Wendy. Good morning, everyone. And again, my name is James Harris, and I'm a human resource consultant here at the North Carolina Office of Human Resources. And today, I have the outstanding opportunity to be able to bring up our guest speaker today. His name is Chuck Wheeler. He's currently the coordinator for the Out South Queer Film Festival, which is entering its 27th year as one of the premier LGBTQ plus film festivals in the U.S. and Canada. Now, prior to his current position, Chuck served as a volunteer for nearly a quarter century for the event, which takes place annually in the historic Carolina Theater in downtown Durham, North Carolina. Out South was formerly known as the North Carolina Gay and Lesbian Film Festival prior to changing its name a few years back. And Chuck spent most of his time as a member of the Field Programming Committee, chairing the men's programming group. He has volunteered longer than anyone at the festival and is often called by the event workers as the old man. I can identify with that. However, his love for film actually predates the festival. Chuck curated feature film retrospectives with Free Water Film Society as an undergraduate at Duke University, and later studied queer theory and film at Duke in the 1990s. Chuck is currently semi-retired, and he lives with his husband and two many dogs and cats in Durham. When speaking about Out South, he acknowledges that sooner or later the festival will go on without me. But as long as the theater still needs volunteers, I will be the first in line. And I can't imagine the festival not being in my life. So, ladies and gentlemen, without any further ado, I bring to you, I introduce some and bring to others Mr. Chuck Wheeler.
Hi, everyone. My name, James, thank you, James. Thank you, Wendy. And I want to thank Gina as well, and Governor Cooper and the state of North Carolina for recognizing Pride Month. Today, we're going to talk about Out South, as James just mentioned. And Out South, like so many LGBTQ events, grew out of June Pride. And June Pride began in 1970. We should all know the story by now, but just in case you require a refresher, on June 29th, 1969, a series of protests erupted at and around the Stonewall Inn in the Greenwich Village neighborhood of Lower Manhattan in New York City. Slide, please. The protest was in reaction, slide, please. Slide, please. This protest was in reaction to the police raiding the bar another time, which they did regularly, at the gay club on Christopher Street. What followed were 6 days of protest and clashes that would serve as the foundation for the gay rights movement in the United States. Much of what I'm telling you here today comes from the Library of Congress, which describes Stonewall as an uprising or rebellion, but it was the police who turned it a riot in order to justify their use of force. Slide, please. Riot, rebellion, or uprising, it was the birth of a movement. Early descriptions of the raucous crowd of protesters mentioned only the white male clientele that frequented Stonewall Inn's popular bar. But in truth, the rioters were a large mix of those patrons, lesbians, transgender women, Latinos, blacks, and drag queens. And many were homeless youth too. And thanks to historians' revisits to this event to identify the participants, many of our early icons emerged from the fight, including Marsha P. Johnson and Sylvia Rivera. Mind you, Stonewall was not the actual beginning of the gay rights movement, as efforts for equality and recognition came from the Daughters of Bilitis, the Janus Society, and the Mattachine Society in years prior to 1969. But again, Stonewall would be the jumping off place for many. By the following month, gays and lesbians in New York City formed the Gay Liberation Front, or GLF, and like one of those dominoes exhibitions in which the pieces fall in perfect sequence, by the end of 1969, there were hundreds of GLFs across the country. In November 1969, it was proposed by the Eastern Regional Conference of homophile organizations that a demonstration be held annually on the last Saturday in June to commemorate the 1969 spontaneous demonstrations on Christopher Street, and this demonstration be called Christopher Street Liberation Day. Slide, please. Now, reading from an interview in Oprah Daily, activist Carla J., an early organizer of GLF, told NPR in an interview, "We set out to create a march on the anniversary of the Stonewall Uprising, and if we hadn't done that, nobody would remember Stonewall today." In the publication Them, activist Brenda Howard went on to note that early ideas, in addition to the Christopher Street demonstration, would be a week of celebration, which eventually evolved into a month of recognition. As a result, Christopher Street Liberation Day is commonly accepted as the mother of pride. So, where did the word pride originate? Social and media were two words hardly ever used 50 years ago, but even then, the event needed a tagline. One member of the planning group, L. Craig Schoonmaker, suggested pride, though gay power was also a strong contender. Schoonmaker claimed that while gay individuals lacked power, one thing they did have was pride. Hence, the slogan was adopted, followed by the official chant, "Say it loud, gay is proud." Slide, please. And the rest is history. By 1995, slide, please. By 1995, the Pride was 25 years old. In celebration, and the event moved from city to city throughout the state of North Carolina. Durham was designated to be the host city for Pride in 1995. And as part of the festivities, the planning committee for Pride approached the Carolina Theater in Durham to ask if they would be willing to host a film festival spotlighting gay, lesbian, bisexual, and transgender pride. This was reportedly the first year that the organizing committee had added bisexual and transgender beneath the Pride banner. So, in April, the theater did agree to screen 4 LGBTQ plus themed films. The North Carolina Pride Conference was scheduled to run June 9 through 12 at the Durham Civic Center and the Den Durham Omni Hotel. All 3 locations faced a common plaza in downtown Durham. The Carolina Theater would screen the films June 2nd through 12, an 11-day festival. Among the films on the roster were Salmonberries, slide please, directed by, slide please, Salmonberries, directed by Percy Adlon and starring Katie Lang, in which two women help each other find closure to tragic events in their past. Slide, please. And The Sum of Us, directed by Jeff Burton and Kevin Dowling, and starring Russell Crowe and Jack Thompson, a comedy drama focusing on a father who has just lost his wife and his gay son looking for Mr. Right. The other two films were actually short compilations. Boys Shorts, The New Queer Cinema, which included a short by acclaimed director of Tongues Untied, Marlon Riggs, and Dyke Drama, directed by John Miller Monzon, known for his work in documentaries. From the outset, the festival would be called A Salute to Pride. As an aside, I have seen in several print references that the beginning fest was called Q-Fest, but in every article I've researched thus far, both the North Carolina Pride Commission and the Carolina Theater titled the festival A Salute to Pride. So, Q-Fest or A Salute to Pride, all four films had no MPAA rating, a factor that would play into the controversies that followed later. Whether anyone expected the festival to proceed without incident is unknown. But in May of that year, several Durham citizens and the Durham Christian Coalition complained to the Durham County Commissioners that the publicly supported Carolina venue should reflect community standards, specifically the sanctity of their definition of family. They were careful, however, to make it clear that their primary concern was that the films were unrated, meaning anyone, including children, could attend the screenings. Secondly, however, they claimed the festival was a promotion of homosexuality. Without having seen any of the four films, there was an implication that the films were obscene by legal standards. They threatened to ask a judge for an injunction forbidding the film festival to occur. With the verbal raucous on full display in print media, it was then that Durham District Attorney Jim Harden Jr. came up with a novel idea to invite the public, including the objectors, who again had freely admitted they hadn't watched any of the films, to attend a community screening of the four films in question. In doing so, he would also decide for himself if any of the films breached any laws pertaining to obscenity. The only way the films could be stopped would be if they were truly deemed to violate community standards of decency, and if they were judged obscene, showing them to the public would be a criminal act. In 1995, North Carolina general statutes defined materials as obscene if they were patently offensive, lack literary, artistic, political, or scientific value, appeal to prurient or erotic interest in sex, or are not protected by the U.S. or state constitutions. So, on their own dime, the Carolina Theater hosted the pre-screening that Harden had suggested. All through the ruckus, the theater's director, Steve Scott Martin, as well as the theater's board of directors, had refused to back down. Though deluged with calls and letters concerning the pending festival, actually about two-thirds were in favor of the festival, not against it. But because it was a public facility, Durham City in 1995 had paid 15% of the theater's operating budget, and Durham taxpayers had shelled out $7.8 million in bond money to refurbish the aging 69-year-old historical building in the heart of downtown. Leadership knew they had to respond in some viable manner to the situation so that they hoped would appease everyone on both sides of the argument, thus the pre-screening. Roughly only 30 members of the Durham community, a low turnout by any standard, attended an 8-hour marathon of films, including, as reported by the Durham Herald, a mix of liberal activists, theater employees, the curious, 2 Durham City Council members, only 1 film festival opponent, and 2 investigators with the Durham Police Department, because by then there were fears that there could be violence at the festival screenings. But the fact that only 1 objector showed up for a pre-screening designed to allay their concerns made it abundantly clear that their ratings weren't on their minds. only the depiction of queer lives on the big screen. The attendee who opposed the festival came away with the same objections she brought with her, saying, "The movies portraying homosexual intimacy threaten to destroy Durham's social fabric, which will ultimately lead to poor schools and a depressed real estate market." Looking back from 2022, that didn't happen, but I digress. A local leader in the Democratic Party told the News and Observer, Raleigh's daily newspaper, "I really think it is a First Amendment issue. Who decides what is bad? And that family values thing. Whose family? Whose values?" A festival advocate, after having watched the films, said, "I think the intolerance in the community is more obscene than any movie." So actually, by the eighth hour of the marathon screenings, most attendees had departed the theater, clearly having seen enough to let them know that all the sound and fury over these films indeed amounted to little or nothing. Crickets. Howard Clement, a leading civil rights activist in North Carolina, and who was a city council member at the time, summed it up neatly. "Frankly, I don't know what the fuss is all about. These films will appeal to some and won't appeal to others. I'm not in the business of telling folks what they can see and what they can't see." So on June 1st, 1995, Durham District Attorney Hardin Jr. made his decision regarding the four films public. "Not only are none of the four movies scheduled to be shown obscene," he said, "TV is worse. I am aware of more graphic sexual activity on daytime and primetime national television than was depicted in any of these movies." He went on to state that he found the films humorous, sad, tragic, innocuous, boring, tame. This process has shown that the films of this series utterly fail each element of the statutorily required test for obscenity. He added that he wished the opponents had actually viewed the films, which they again chose not to do. The coalition's takeaway was quote unquote satisfaction that the movies were not obscene, and they viewed their efforts as a partial victory as the theater promised to screen unrated movies before showing them to determine age-appropriate audiences. Said a representative of the coalition in summary, "We want the theater to succeed in a way that's beneficial for the core of the community, which is family. It's not that we're trying to be unkind to anyone. We just really don't need to know what people's sex lives are like." The festival was approved to open the following night. So, how did everything go, you ask? For better or worse, the Durham Christian Coalition's fever-pitched protest against the festival had generated much curiosity, and the event, which would likely have been a success even without the dispute, proved to be a huge hit. The local newspaper's headline read, "Gay Lesbian Films Bonanza for Carolina. Ticket sales exceeded $10,000. In comparison, the theater had also hosted an Asian American Film Festival, which grossed approximately $4,000, and their popular African American Film Festival had garnered $11,000. Said the interim director of programming, Jim Hardin, "This is a great showing." By extension, the controversy was also a boon to the theater itself, as donations poured in supporting the Carolina. Even a representative from the coalition acknowledged the unintended outcome. "We gave a salute to pride in the Carolina theater plenty of advertising. For anyone who didn't know it was here, they know it now. Indeed, say it loud, queer is proud." As for the Pride March itself, slide please, on June 12th, it was reported that over 5,000 people attended, and according to a few who were there was a thunderstorm moments before the march began, followed by a rainbow as the peaceful crowd began their trek from Duke University's East Campus and around the streets of Durham. Surprisingly or unsurprisingly, there were hardly any protesters along the parade route, and on-site protesters for the film festival is too. It is interesting to note that the Carolina Theater also hosted another gay film series, not a festival, in July 1995, in conjunction with Chapel Hill's Crepe Myrtle Festival. Crepe Myrtle originated as a backyard party in Wilmington, North Carolina, and mushroomed into a week-long event drawing thousands of people to Chapel Hill and the area's Triangle, as this area is often called. Their goal was to raise money to distribute to Triangle AIDS programs. Though not called a festival, there was a slogan, "Ain't no stopping us now," tied to Crepe Myrtle's theme for that year. The theater screened for 1 week Sir Ian McKellen's documentary, Playing the Part, the lesbian drama, Only the Brave, and Rob Epstein's Southern travel documentary, Where Are We? There was no uproar surrounding the screening of the 3 films. Kathy Moon, marketing director of the theater at the time, said, "This is just a benefit that we're going to support the community. There's no problem with this as far as I know." So barely 1 month had passed since the film festival controversy, and already the city of Durham and its citizens had moved on as far as LGBTQ plus themed films. And again, in December 1995, in front of the Carolina Theater, there was a candlelight vigil to mark Human Rights Awareness Week, World AIDS Day, and the opening of the Human Rights International Film Festival. Again, no protest, no outcry came from the Durham community. In 1996, the Carolina Theater and its new film programming director, Jim Carl, decided to produce and host its own gay and lesbian film festival. It would not be in June, but in August, mainly due to the fact that it would be necessary to schedule the new festival around competing LGBTQ plus film festivals around the country. It would be called the North Carolina Gay and Lesbian Film Festival. Slide, please. The theater proclaimed that the festival pays tribute, slide please, that the festival pays tribute to an historical struggle, explores important and controversial issues, and celebrates the diversity of our community through the visual voice of film. The festival committee, comprised of volunteers from across the Triangle, had worked for months planning the festival's events. They selected the festival's films to represent a broad spectrum of gay and lesbian filmmaking and life. There were 8 full-length features and documentaries, plus 3 shorts, not many films. But what variety for a nascent queer film festival. Slide, please. There was pioneering new queer cinema director Barbara Hammer's Tender Fictions, an autobiographical pastiche of Hammer as a lesbian artist in the filmmaking world, and Hammer attended the screening of her film. Slide, please. Also in attendance that year was filmmaker Sonia DeVries with her documentary Gay Cuba, a look at the treatment of the country's gay and lesbian populace since the Cuban Revolution in 1959. Gay cult favorite Stonewall, slide please, a fictionalized, heavily melodramatic retelling of the Stonewall riots, and not to be confused with the 2015 feature, dubbed Where Are All the Trans Women of Color, Stonewall, and not was on the bill. The 1995 version still lacks the profound diversity of the moment that marked the beginning of a movement, but it does manage to acknowledge that not everybody inside and outside the bar on that historic day was white, and it boasts a career-defining performance by Guillermo Diaz as drag diva La Miranda. Slide, please. Parallel Sons was that rare LGBTQ plus film from the last century that explored both racial and queer disparity in our culture. Slide, please. Fresh Kill featured actress Sarita Chowdhury, who starred in 1991 opposite Denzel Washington in Mississippi Masala. Slide, please. Tokyo Cowboy was an interesting twist on finding the girl of one's dreams, or in this case, the man. And in recognition that the Carolina Theater is the undisputed home of retro cinema, slide please, additionally in the lineup was 1968's The Queen, a raucously epic documentary about the New York drag scene, slide please, that featured House of LaVesia co-founder Crystal LaVesia and an uncredited Dorian Carey, proving that Paris was already burning nearly 25 years before Jenny Livingston's now iconic Paris is Burning. The film doesn't fully examine the racial politics of queerness that is front and center in Livingston's film, but the racism in a drag world largely controlled by white performers potently simmers directly beneath the surface. LaBeouf's fierce read in the closing moments of the film to the white-centric competition remains the stuff of diva legend. For those of you who don't know, Crystal LaBeija is considered the mother of house and drag ball culture. Slide, please. During the first screening of Hammer's autobiographical Tender Fictions, the sound went out and the theater staff had to stop the show. Then Hammer, who was a guest at the festival, jumped up on the stage and talked with the audience, telling them what they would have seen and answering audience questions. Talk about cinema verite. And yes, there were parties and receptions to complement the screenings. The official first festival was a massive success, meaning an annual event would follow. So, was NCGLFF 1996 queer enough? A question often asked when studying the history of queer film festivals by 2022 standards. Okay, we admit that maybe the abundantly kitschy Vegas in Space was a near miss, but you learn by your choices. Anyway, whatever your answer, 1996 was undoubtedly a uniquely auspicious start that set a fairly high bar for the 25 festivals that followed in an LGBTQ plus film festival debuting in a small southern city in North Carolina. A fertile beginning for a festival that would blossom at the Carolina Theater in Bull Durham. But what about possible protest in 1996? Would there be a similar uproar? Slide, please. Remember, in 1995, there had been a vocal brouhaha over the Pride Film Festival. Much had been made over the years about the early protest. Much has been made over the past years about the early protest crowds and festival fans being forced to navigate through the groups of protesters. It does make for good press. But when you look at the news reports from those years, you quickly realize there was more noise than numbers. A year after the Pride Festival, the headlines in the Durham Herald-Sun newspaper read, "Carolina Gay Festival is on again. Protest isn't." The Christian Coalition, which had led the charge against the film festival in 1995, flatly stated that a protest in 1996 would be pointless. The Durham County Commissioners had reduced their supervision over the theater's operations earlier in the year, disappointing the opposition. Said the coalition, "The management of the Carolina Theater is going to do what they want." They insisted that the Carolina films promoted an anti-family lifestyle, said one activist. "All they show is triple X-rated smut. If it doesn't have sex and violence in it, they won't show it." Steve Scott Martin, the director of the Carolina, countered by saying that the festival shows to the community that there is an audience for quality gay and lesbian theater, and we're working to do things that are worthwhile to the community. Don't come if you're not interested. Not everything we do is for everyone. By 1997, the North Carolina Gay and Lesbian Film Festival only rated a few lines in most area publications, mainly with emphasis on the film's screening as part of the event. There were protesters on site at the early festivals and throughout the years, but in truth, they rarely numbered more than 10 to 15 individuals. But thanks to maybe a Mr. Microphone, they were noisy, yet they were largely ignored by theater goers. Attendees would frustrate them by offering free hugs, or they would try to engage them in lively debates that would sadly change nobody's minds, and the oppressive August heat would further frustrate them. There was never any violence. After the horror of 9/11, there were concerns that protests would again erupt, and the theater temporarily hired security to monitor the entryways. But thankfully, there was never any known threat. I am a longtime resident of Durham, having hung around after graduating from Duke in the 1970s. As an undergraduate, I recall the Nixon-McGovern race, your classic liberal versus conservative clash, wherein there was never any doubt that North Carolina would back the soon-to-be disgraced incumbent president. I remember reading in, I believe it was the Rolling Stone, that the city of Durham and surrounding area was this unique island our paradise of liberal freedom surrounded by a very red populace outside its city limits. Durham was indeed a special place, and its inhabitants already knew nearly 60 years ago that they were different. So if you were planning to organize an inaugural queer film festival anywhere in this state, Durham and the Research Triangle area would have been the obvious choice. It has always been the state's most welcoming city, in my opinion. So any expression that any expectation that a monumental disagreement over an LGBTQ film festival would amount to anything would have been wrong. Again, the protests were real, but they were always small, largely ignored, and eventually abandoned. I don't have time in this presentation to provide you a year-by-year account of NCGLFF, now Out South, but I wanted to report here the early years. But trust me, this festival has a fascinating history. Beginning in 1997, the festival added live acts for several years to attract even more fans. Slide, please. Notable guests included comedian Margaret Cho, the Golden Girls, Rue McClanahan, comedian Caroline Ray, comedian Bruce Valanche, local boy and Village People singer Randy Jones, filmmaker Cheryl Dunye, and comedian Kathy Griffin. For many fans, the most memorable guest was actor Tab Hunter, slide please, who in 2006, just after his autobiography, Tab Hunter Confidential, had been published, came to the festival. I remember interviewing Hunter on stage in the theater's expansive Fletcher Hall, and not only was there a large LGBTQ plus audience, there were a few hundred allies who had been fans of Hunter since he was a teen idol also showing up. And at the 2019 NCGLFF, slide please, we had the pleasure of hosting a local hero, leading activist Mandy Carter, who reminded us in a moving presentation that past was indeed present in the changing political landscape of the time. And the celebrities weren't always on stage. Slide, please. I should add that fashion icon, and again, a local hero, Andre Leontally, was a regular of the festival for a few years. Talley was born in Washington, D.C., but he was reared right here in Durham by his amazing and loving grandmother, Benny Francis Davis, who had a flair for fashion. He attended Hillside High School and North Carolina Central University in the Bull City. And then back when Out South was NCGLFF, we would sometimes see Talley in the audience of the festivals. He would always remain in his seat after a film had concluded and the theater had emptied of patrons, and I would walk over and chat with him for a few minutes, and he was never afraid to speak his mind about the quality of a film and to remind me that there was still a need for more diversity in our selections. I felt like I was in the presence of royalty every time I talked to Talley. He was a fantastic person. Quite honestly, attendance grew year after year into the late 2010s, with nearly 10,000 tickets being sold for a few of those years. And somewhere along the way, the city of Durham designated the festival as a signature event. In 2018, along with development coordinator Amy Clemens, I queried the theater about changing the name of the festival from NCGLFF, emphasis on gay and lesbian, to a moniker that would reflect the entire queer community. I want to emphasize here that NCGLFF had always been a festival that aimed for diversity in its selections. If you look back at the selections, even in the 2 years we've discussed here, you'll see even in 1995 and 1996, there were lesbian, gay, transgender, and bisexual characters. But we believed that the actual name of the festival had to reflect a celebration of both gender identification and sexual orientation, as well as representation that embraced the intersectionality within our community. The theater did not resist the idea. They embraced it. And Jim Carl, the senior director of programming at the theater, came up, slide please, with the new name Out South Queer Film Festival, a descriptor that not only expanded the notion of who we are, but would also actively acknowledge local and regional filmmakers in the Southeast. We were ecstatic that in 2020 we would debut Out South to our audience, as it would also be the 25th year of the festival. But then came COVID-19. Like everywhere in the United States and the world, the pandemic resulted in widespread quarantine to restrict the spread of the deadly virus, and movie theaters everywhere closed their doors to the public. By 2021, and after a few delays, Out South did premiere in 2020, but it was solely an online festival. By 2021, with variants of the virus still raging, the Carolina Theater actually closed temporarily. Even an online film festival was in doubt. But thanks to the theater's new COO, Randy McKay, programming director Jim Carl, and marketing's Hannah Mercer, as well as a dedicated small bunch of volunteers, Out South did run. And again, it was a virtual festival. So here in 2022, we are planning finally to again go live. That is in person, slide please, at the Carolina Theater, August 11th through 14th, followed by an Opry Fest, which will highlight the films that debut over the official dates of Out South. In other words, it's still going to be about a 10-day festival with Opry Fest included. That, everyone, will be quite an accomplishment, and we look forward to welcoming you back. Stay tuned for more once we announce the festival lineup in early July, and I hope you are planning to attend. You might say to me that queer cinema has long been mainstream. So why now do we continue with these events year after year? And since this is Pride Month and the streaming airways are flush with LGBTQ plus examples from Heartstopper to The New Queer as Folk to Fire Island, you might be even more convinced that we no longer need queer film festivals. But exactly how mainstream, representative, and accessible is queer cinema? So I'm going to give you some facts and figures here. Did you know that every year the Gay and Lesbian Alliance Against Defamation, or GLAAD, publishes a report on LGBTQ plus representation in both television and film, including streaming for both broadcast TV and in-person cinema, called the Where We Are Report. Before we look at the stats, let's talk about historian Vito Russo, who was primarily responsible for the report we're going to discuss. Russo was a gay rights activist, a film historian, and an author best known for his book, The Celluloid Closet, a groundbreaking chronicle of gays and lesbians in film. In 1996, The Celluloid Closet was made into a documentary that was co-produced and narrated by Lily Tomlin. The Celluloid Closet is a product of its time. That is, its focus is largely on gays and lesbians, but it remains the standard for all queer histories on representation and in film and television to this day. Diagnosed with HIV in 1985, Russo was a frequent protester with ACT UP. In 1986, Russo lost his longtime partner to AIDS. Outraged by the media's inadequate and inaccurate coverage of the AIDS pandemic, Russo founded GLAAD, an organization that monitors LGBT representation in media. Sadly, Russo died from AIDS complications in 1980, and in his memory, GLAAD created the Vito Russo Media Award to recognize out LGBT media professionals who have made a significant difference promoting equality. And to this day, GLAAD uses what is called the Vito Russo test to report statistics on queer representation in film and television. Taking inspiration from the Bechdel test, which examines the way female characters are portrayed and situated within a narrative, GLAAD developed its own set of criteria to analyze how LGBTQ plus characters are included within a film. To pass to pass the Vito Russo test, the following must be true. Number one, the film contains a character that is identifiably lesbian, gay, bisexual, and/or transgender. Two, that character must not be solely or predominantly defined by sexual orientation or gender identity, i.e., they are made up of the same sort of unique character traits commonly used to differentiate straight characters from one another. Three, the LGBTQ plus character must be tied into the plot in such a way that their removal would have a significant effect, meaning they are not there to simply provide colorful commentary, paint urban authenticity, or perhaps most commonly, set up the punchline. Put bluntly, the character should matter. So in 2021, here's what GLAAD reported for television. They found that of the 775 series regular characters scheduled to appear on scripted broadcast primetime programming for that season, 92 characters, or 11.9%, were LGBTQ plus, an increase of 2.8 percentage points from the previous year, and marking a new high percentage of LGBTQ plus series regulars on broadcast. There were an additional 49 LGBTQ plus recurring characters on the platform for a total of 141 on broadcast. On primetime scripted cable series, GLAAD counted 87 series regular LGBTQ plus characters and 51 LGBTQ plus recurring characters, totaling 138. That was an increase of 20 characters from the previous year. Of the LGBTQ characters counted in this report, there were 2 asexual characters. Bisexual characters made up 29% of all the queer characters on broadcast, cable, and streaming. This was an increase of 1% from the previous year. The number heavily favored women. In the same year, there were 42 transgender regular and recurring characters across all of broadcast, cable, and streaming. They were made up of 20 trans women, 14 trans men, and 8 trans characters who identified as non-binary. 41 out of 42 were played or voiced by trans actors. Of the 775 series regulars on primetime scripted broadcast series, 47% were women, an increase of 1 percentage point from the previous year and a new record high. Now, looking at the genre itself, of all primetime series regulars on broadcast, 50% were characters of color, a 4% percentage point increase from the previous year, and a new record high for people of color representation on broadcast. Racial diversity of LGBTQ characters on broadcast and streaming also increased, while cable saw a decrease. Series regular characters with disabilities counted a decrease, down to 2.8% from a high of 3.5% in 2019. This number falls far below the actual number of those with disabilities in the United States. The number of characters living with HIV across all platforms decreased from 3 to 2. Looking at films, figures from 2020, of the 44 films that GLAAD counted from the major studios, 22.7% contained LGBTQ plus characters. This was an increase of 4.1%, but a decrease from 2019. The limited number of films released theatrically in 2020 is a direct result and consequence of the COVID-19 pandemic, which shut down theaters in the US and globally for large portions of the year. There was a decrease in bisexual representation, though there was an increase in lesbian representation. Of the films in the universe with LGBTQ characters, 60% had a gay character, down 8%. 50% had a lesbian character, an uptick from 2019, but lower than 2018, and bisexuals decreased from 14% to 10%. Amongst major studio releases, there were no transgender or non-binary characters counted. Racial diversity of LGBTQ plus characters did see a welcome increase, 40% with people of color, a 6% hike over 2019, but 17% lower than the record high in 2017. The actual breakdown, 55% white, 15% Asian American Pacific Islander, 10% Latinx, 10% Black, and 5% Indigenous. No characters with disabilities. And as far as genre goes, comedy was the most inclusive, followed by action, sci-fi, fantasy, horror, family, drama with none, and documentary with none. So, if you're a queer person looking for yourself in mainstream media, you can certainly find it today. And though a true bright spot in the 2020 results found an increase in diversity, most of them were gay, lesbian, or bisexual. Transgender and non-binary folks were hardly visible. Again, the presence of COVID in the film and television industry had a negative impact on production and output, but arguably it shouldn't have had an effect on the presence of queer characters. We still don't know where film is headed in this post-COVID world, and though it is becoming the norm for action, adventure, horror, and fantasy films to find success in theaters, while romantic comedies and dramas are being routinely released on major studio streaming platforms. How these trends will affect representation and accessibility is anyone's guess for now. So, back to why we need queer film festivals. We need complete visibility and representation, with a watchful eye on intersectionality for obvious reasons. We cannot just screen a festival with lesbians and gays in every frame and proclaim we've performed our job. Diversity must be addressed. Neither can we point to sexual orientation as fluent within every film, but then ignore gender identity. We should strive to represent every member of the queer community in a queer film festival to let them know they are part of us. It won't always happen. It won't always happen, I admit, as any festival is arguably held prisoner to the submissions it receives for consideration. But we're stating a goal to which we should always aspire. You come to a queer film festival to learn, and more importantly, just see how diverse our alphabet is. Film festivals provide context in a world where truth is too often sacrificed to lies. Festivals should provide history. They should remind us of a past where we were effectively erased everywhere. Reading from Leanne Dawson, I'll get a little academic for a moment. Historically, such festivals catered to a specific audience base and created a counter-public sphere, and now often aim for what is frequently known as a safe space. A significant factor of film festivals is the liveness of the event, i.e., the bodily presence of audiences, filmmakers, and critics, which is a significant element in the formation of the festival community and for the festival operating as a public sphere. This presence of community, coupled with rituals, generates a festival event and the resulting impact of that on audience members, which differs significantly from a regular night at the cinema, where you might see a queer character. Rituals, hype, and the feeling of belonging to a group create the event culture that make festival screenings attractive to many. They are also a big factor in the ongoing proliferation of LGBTQ plus films. These goals of representation and visibility are vital in 2022 because with each passing day, there is a growing fear that we are again being erased. Look, I'm 68 years old, and for the first 20 or so years of my life, I was taught that homosexuality was a sin and that all queers were pedophiles. Of the handful of people I knew to be gay or lesbian in the small town where I grew up in North Carolina, most of them were ostracized. Or if they were accepted, it was because they completely hid or denied their sexual orientation or gender identity. Even when I did come out after college, it wasn't a very welcoming world for anyone queer. But you always believed that change for the better was inevitable. And with the passage of the Marriage Equality Act not that many years ago, the glass did begin to appear more than half full. Fast forward, however, to the present, and everything old and toxic is new again. Let's just take a look at the past several months in America with respect to queer liberties and rights. The most discussed harmful law against LGBTQ plus people is Florida's so-called Don't Say Gay bill. Quoting from the Washington Post, it bans instruction or classroom discussion about LGBTQ issues for kindergarten through third grade. It should be addressed, however, that sex education has already been banned in Florida, as in many states, until the fifth grade. So critics say the law tries to solve a problem that doesn't exist for the state's youngest students. For older students, discussion about gay and transgender issues has to be age appropriate or developmentally appropriate, terms too nebulous to define as they are far too general to allow elaboration. The law is effectively a statement that classroom education about sexual orientation and gender identification shouldn't start at an early age, and that parents should have final say about what their children learn and when. It aims to reinforce the fundamental rights of parents to make decisions regarding the upbringing and control of their children according to the text of the legislation. Critics contend that because it limits even discussions about LGBTQ plus issues, it could stifle conversations for children and possibly older children, as well as older adults, depending on how the broad language of the law's text is interpreted, who need to work through their own gender or sexual identity questions. Closer to home, last week, prior to a gay pride celebration in Apex, North Carolina, there was an effort, ultimately defeated, to eliminate the drag queen story hour from the town's pride celebration. On that same weekend that Apex held its event, 5 members of the white nationalist group, the Proud Boys, stormed another drag queen story hour hosted by Panda Dulce at a library in San Francisco's Bay Area. According to witnesses, the children in attendance were frightened by the jeers and taunts from the small group of men who shouted derogatory comments to the presenter and appeared to be trying to escalate the situation to violence. In Idaho last weekend, 31 white nationalists from the Patriot Front were arrested before they could potentially incite violence at a pride celebration. These anti-LGBTQ plus campaigns by these extremist groups are not only homophobic, they speak to a wave of bigotry and racism gaining new traction in this country. In 2022 alone, a staggering count of hundreds of bills designed to eliminate LGBTQ plus rights have been filed in the U.S. in approximately 40 states. From NPR's Melissa Block in an interview with Elsa Chang, a majority of the bills contain really homophobic and dangerous language, and it harkens back to a theme. Yes.
Yes, I just wanted to step in for a moment here because we have some people that would really love to have some questions for you. And we are wrapping up in a few minutes. And I've enjoyed your presentation, but I do have some questions, and there are some people that would like to have their questions answered. So I wanted to allow for that.
Okay,
If you
man,
don't mind.
I've got like less than a minute here. May I finish?
Okay, go ahead.
I was on the last paragraph. Sorry, everyone. So let me read a quote from an Ohio school commencement address from just last week, where the presenter encouraged people only to marry according to family standards, a male with a female and a female with a male. Imagine being a student in that high school graduating class and being told that and thinking, am I the only one? Think about being a young person with same-sex parents in Florida and being told you can't talk about your family in certain environments. And again, asking, am I the only one? When I was growing up in Eastern North Carolina, I knew I was gay from an early age. As a school student, one of my teachers recognized that I felt like an outsider to my classmates. So she presented me one day with a copy of Walt Whitman's Leaves of Grass, and she said, you might not understand why I'm doing this, but I'm giving you this book to inform you that you are not the only one. I was lucky that this amazing woman cared enough to let me know it would be okay. But we are living in a new world where it is becoming increasingly difficult to come out, whatever your age, without fear of reprisal. Film festivals exist to provide safe space and community. We shouldn't need safe spaces, but I don't make the law, and now our rights are being challenged everywhere. You need to be reminded through a film festival that we are not alone. Silence equals erasure. So say it loud and proud that you are a queer person. The more we are pushed back in the closet, the more some of us are going to hide. So we need these festivals as destinations where we can gather and celebrate our community safely and proudly to learn about our past, address the turmoil that is growing in the present, and hopefully stand together against what's happening today to prevent it from becoming tomorrow's world. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Chuck, and we appreciate your presentation today. It was very, very informative. And I do have a couple of questions here for you. The first one is, and also for anyone that would like to submit a question to the chat, please feel free to do so. Submit your questions to the host, and we will get those questions out to our presenter today, to Chuck. Chuck, my first question for you is. Um, how do you find the YouTube channel for the film festival?
YouTube channel for the film festival. I am not aware of the YouTube channel for the film festival this year. That there was a YouTube channel in 2020 and 2021 when we had the virtual festival. Uh, but this year, as the festival will be live, all events will be on site at the Carolina Theater here in Durham.
Okay, well, we will stay tuned for that, and we're grateful that the film festival will be live this year. With that being said, are there opportunities for people to volunteer?
Yes, and you're talking to the person who would love for you to volunteer. A call for volunteers will go out most likely in July, and we would love to have you. You'll probably get some swag as a result of being a volunteer, and be invited to some of the events as well as get tickets to some of the films. So keep an eye on the Carolina Theater website regarding Out South Queer Film Festival for volunteer opportunities.
Okay, that's good to know that there are opportunities to volunteer. What do you see for the future of the festival?
The future, I'm going to be conservative here. Right now, the future that we're hoping for is a live festival. Um, Having been virtual for the past 2 years, we are really excited that we will be back at the Carolina uh, in person, and we hope that large crowds will attend. It's going to be great, everybody.
Yes, I'm sure it is going to be a great festival again this year, as I know you've gone through and carefully selected your films for this year. And I also see here one of my last questions is going to be, do any of the filmmakers from the earlier festivals ever return to attend the events? And do you have some that stand out in your mind?
Well, one that stands out, I mentioned Cheryl Dunye earlier. She made a film called The Watermelon Woman, which is one of my favorite queer films. That's perhaps one of my fondest memories. And yes, they do. Many of the artists do return, and we look forward to them coming back this year if possible. But more so, when you present new films each year, you get new artists attending, and we're excited about who might be attending this year for their films that'll be debuting at the festival.
Okay, and I promise this is the last question that I have.
It's
You,
because I talk too much. I apologize.
no, no, no. We enjoyed your presentation. My final question is, you did show that you had live performances or people coming to perform live. Will that be for this year as well?
No, there will be no live performers this year. That's an idea that we do have many people say, are we going to bring back the live acts? That's not a decision I would make. That would be up to the theater's executive staff. So if you'd like to see someone, a live performer return, feel free to query the Carolina and urge them to do so in the future. But all through the year, there are many, many live acts that appear at the Carolina, and many of those acts are actually LGBTQ plus. So don't come just during the festival. Come to the Carolina year round, please.
We will definitely look to come to the Carolina, not just in August, but around throughout the year. And I appreciate you coming today to speak with us, Chuck. And we are looking forward to the festival in August. And here with the state of North Carolina, we are celebrating LGBTQ Pride Month. And on behalf of the Office of State Human Resources, again, we are glad to have you here presenting today. And we appreciate you taking the time to come out and speak to us about Out South and the film festival itself. And again, we just like to celebrate LGBTQ Pride Month. And again, thank you for having the film festival. And we are anticipating the live festival in person again this year. Everyone, please make sure you mark this on your calendars and look forward to this film festival coming forth. And again, we will have presentations for Juneteenth coming up on the 22nd. So we're looking forward to having you then. And at this time, we would just like to thank you for attending our event and look to see this out posted on demand. And thank you and have a nice day and happy Pride Month.
Thank you, everyone.